So, The Gentleman. Is Guy Ritchie doing what Guy Ritchie does best? Bit of a return to form for him. This is a gangster picture, or I guess sort of more like a crime picture in which everything just sort of snowballs and we follow multiple characters and then accidents happen to these characters and then all these events sort of collide and it just turns into a very slick and fast-paced crazy tale. That seems kind of like par for the course for Ritchie, and I guess that's sort of like the best and the worst thing to say about this Guy Ritchie film is that it does feel like, Ritchie's in his element here. Like, this is the type of like direction and storytelling that he does best, writing quirky characters in a fairly big ensemble. You have an all-star cast here as well. This seems everything that's suited well for him. I just feel like, and it's not because I didn't like the film. It just feels like, this kind of feels just kind of par for the course for Guy Ritchie. It's like, of course, I know he could do this kind of film, and there's not really a lot of huge surprises if you're familiar with his filmography. But that being said, I actually kind of really dug the film. I especially love how it very much has this nonlinear format where we start off by following Mickey Pearson, who's played by Matthew McConaughey, who is sort of this secretive drug lord. He runs a big marijuana game in Europe. He has this very elaborate set of operations. We meet him for a moment, but then we cut away to his basically his hired muscle, played by Charlie Hunnam. And Charlie Hunnam comes home, and Hugh Grant plays a reporter there. Well, a reporter / aspiring writer who basically, he sort of wants to be the narrator here. He wants to tell us the story of how this crime went down to a point. Now, in classic, Guy Ritchie fashion, of course, he doesn't just direct the film. He also wrote the story as well. The dialogue here is very, very slick and finds very interesting ways of trying to get information out into this film. I especially like the way that Hugh Grant tries to relay this information as Fletcher, as this guy who's very giddy and eccentric about, wanting to reveal all this information. I love how the story just takes all these weird routes where you're not quite sure where it's going to go or who's going to betray who. In several scenes, it seems like it goes back and forth. Like, it seems like one character has him on the ropes and then it goes back to the other, and then, they just kind of trade bouts. So we have a huge ensemble here. Charlie Hunnam, I feel, really does a great job essentially playing the straight man here. Like, he's not really playing the hero. He's just sort of like, the guy who stands off to the side and occasionally chimes in. He does get some fun moments here, obviously. It's a Guy Ritchie film. You got to have some humor, some dark humor, of course. But there's all these other little elements. Like, there's this there's this cocky Chinese mafia gangster called Dry Eye, played by Henry Golding, who's very much about wanting to basically shake the cage of crime here and take ownership, and basically conspires to get Mickey out of his business. You have Jeremy Strong playing Matthew Berger, the guy who wants to buy Mickey's business, but it seems like he might have an ulterior motive for it. And then, of course, you got Colin Farrell, who's playing Coach. And he's essentially just like a coach of a gym who's just trying to raise some good boys who get into too much trouble. Like, they try to rip off weed operations, and they get into a lot of fights, and they try to make viral hits out of their fights. So he's just trying to maintain the peace a little bit throughout all this. And then there's all these little elements, like there'll be small characters that will come into play here that will seem like nothing, but then they'll come back to bite the character in the ass. And of course, everything just kind of snowballs from there. Very, very slickly edited. I especially love how, with Fletcher, it's not just that he's relaying the crime, because he's essentially trying to blackmail Charlie Hunnam's character of Raymond, but he's also trying to pitch it as a script. So throughout it, we go back and forth trying to decide, okay, what is the real part of the story here of the crime that went down here, and what is part of Fletcher's script that he's promoting to Hollywood. It gets particularly meta towards the end of this film, where it literally has Fletcher going to pitch this kind of film to Miramax. So it's and it actually kind of seems like a film that Miramax would make too. So So there's all these like little interesting components, and it's just fun just to watch it all kind of connect and clash with each other. The way that Matthew Berger seems to be this sort of like, stuffy socialite who thinks he knows the whole score, whereas Mickey Pearson is sort of this kind of like trying to contain his laid back grit type of character, which is kind of a surprise for Matthew McConaughey. We expect McConaughey to give laid-back performances, but here he's trying to be laid back because he's trying to kind of push that life of crime aside, but at the same time realize that, he has to assert his dominance in this film. It especially works since a little bit of the unreliable narrator structure kind of plays greatly with McConaughey. Like, one moment he could just be laying back, just talking philosophically about, how he views, the world and how his operation functions. And the next minute he could just be screaming and pointing a gun at someone's head and blowing their brains out. Could go any way here. In particular, I like the fact that the first like bit of like really gruesome violence doesn't actually happen until like pretty far into the film, and it comes like as a bit of a surprise from McConaughey. It's just sort of like, okay, we even like the characters acknowledge, okay, we got to shake this up a bit, This is all like slick and fast paced, and it's got some great dialogue here, but we need to pick up the pace a little bit. So I appreciated that aspect. One thing we really got to talk about with this film, is how gay it is, and I mean this in a fairly positive way. It's like, how like those 80s and 90s films, stuff like kind of like Commando and some of like the buddy cop films from that era always had this a little bit of like a either a little bit or quite a lot of like a queer edge to it, where like it's so close to like having the characters be gay for each other, but it'll never go that route, even though there's so many signs for it. The Gentleman is pretty much in that same territory here. Like it pretty much becomes like obvious about halfway through the film. Like when we start off with Fletcher coming to see Raymond, like Fletcher is not just eccentric, he's very flirtatious too. Like throughout the entire time he's with Raymond, he's not just toying with him, like he's tantalizing the possibility, that he might have a shot with this guy. To the point where like, he's saying like, hey, sit next to me on the couch, or he might inadvertently put his hand on his thigh, to the point where their meeting seems to be at an end, and he quite literally asks if he can go to bed with him. It's that, and it's not just with their relationship too, it's with like a whole bunch of other male relationships too in the film, which really dance around a lot of sexuality. There's a lot of sexual talk among them. Like they talk about how much they bench press. They talk about affections they have for one another. They talk a lot about sexual acts. This is ripe for queer theory. It's right up there, which I kind of appreciate it. Although, it kind of does become a little frustrating, where it's just like, they're so close to just having like, straight up gay characters. I mean, like Fletcher is pretty much straight up gay, but everyone else is kind of like, kind of like, they're kind of queer, but they're not gonna admit it. So a little frustrating in that aspect. With all like, it's a very gritty film. Like, the violence is pretty brutal at times. The dialogue is pretty mean. It deals a lot with like with the drug trade. There's one particular gross out moment where in order to intimidate someone, Matthew McConaughey basically poisons their tea and makes them kind of projectile vomit all over the place. So it gets pretty gross at times. But I kind of expected that with the territory here, especially when it involves murder, especially messy and accidental murders that happen in this film. So I mean, you kind of expect it. There's like the film definitely has like a little bit of an edgy draw to it, especially since all the characters are essentially kind of villains, and they do speak in very derogatory terms here, especially like racial terms as well. Like when they're dealing with the Chinese mafia, they're pretty damn racist about it. So it's weird. Like, I really love the construction of this film. I love the pacing. I love the energy. The all-star cast here is on point. Everyone is giving it their all in these roles, but that's mostly because they're handed out some juicy dialogue by Guy Ritchie here. Like, that really works for this script. but it always felt like it needed something a little more. Like it needed something to push it a little bit over the edge. And considering this is a film where there's sexual relations with an animal, it feels like there should be more. I don't know. I feel like in this day and age where we have a lot of like, these like, crazy crime flicks where everything goes awry and accidents happen and all these quirky characters are interacting with one another, it feels like we have a lot more of those films now, that if I almost feel like Guy Ritchie needs to like kind of up the ante here. That being said, for what the film does present, for what it's trying to be, I think it mostly gets the job done. There's nothing here that's going to make me, jump out of my seat and make me say that, Guy Ritchie has finally made his masterpiece. No, this is just kind of, Guy Ritchie just kind of, settling into what he does best, with a great group of actors doing the best they can with the material they got. I really enjoyed the film. I wish it had just a little bit more to it, and that's not a slam against it. I really loved it, but I think it needs a little bit more, especially because you have a great cast here, and I feel like I feel like it should have gone it's a little bit off the rails, but I feel like it should have gone a lot more off the rails. Maybe a little bit crazy, maybe a little bit more slick, but it's still a fun film. It's a very fun and frenetic thriller for what it's worth. So, for Guy Ritchie's The Gentleman, 3.5 out of 5 stars.